When I first stumbled upon the cabin, it didn't seem like much. In fact, it was listed on a forgotten property auction website as nothing more than abandoned rural dwelling, sold as is. The pictures were grainy, the listing was short, and the only detail that stood out was the starting bid, 25 cents. I laughed when I saw it, thinking it had to be some kind of joke. How could any piece of property, even a dilapidated shack, be sold for less than the price of a stick? Of gum? Still. Something about it intrigued me. The listing described the property as sitting on several acres of wooded land, tucked away in a quiet valley outside a small town. It mentioned an old cabin, uninhabited for years, with no guarantees of structural soundness. It also mentioned in passing that the previous owner had failed to pay property taxes for years. Normally, such details would have scared people away, but to me, it sounded like an opportunity. With a few clicks, I placed a bid. No one else bothered to join the auction. By the end of the day, the cabin was mine, all for a single quarter. When I received the paperwork in the mail, I half expected to find a catch, yet it was legitimate. I held the deed in my hands, signed and stamped by the county. I had become the proud owner of a cabin in the woods, and it had cost me less than a candy bar. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to drive out and see my new property. The first trip there was surreal. The cabin stood deep within a stretch of pine forest, accessible only by a narrow gravel road that wound between hills and creeks. When I arrived, I saw a structure that looked more like a ghost of the past than a functioning home. Its roof sagged under the weight of years, its windows were clouded with dust, and vines crawled up the sides of its wooden frame. Yet despite the wear, there was a sturdiness to the way it stood, as though it had weathered every storm and refused to collapse. The land around it was what truly amazed me. Acres upon acres of untouched greenery stretched in every direction. There were wildflowers sprouting at the edges of the clearing, deer tracks pressed into the soil, and the distant sound of a creek running through the valley. Standing there, breathing in the crisp mountain air, I realized that I had stumbled into something extraordinary. At first, I treated it as nothing more than a curiosity. I visited on weekends, sweeping out the dust, patching a few leaks, and slowly bringing the cabin back to life. The locals rarely came this far out, and when I did venture into town, I noticed the surprised looks when I mentioned owning the property. Most people had assumed the cabin would rot until it disappeared. A few even whispered stories about it, tales of a recluse who had lived there decades ago, and how the property had been left in limbo after his passing. What no one expected, least of all me, was how the value of the land would skyrocket. Within months of my purchase, rumors spread of a new resort being built just over the ridge. Investors began buying up parcels of land, developers surveyed the area, and realtors whispered that the valley was about to become the next big destination. My little quarter purchase, once seen as worthless, suddenly became the most desirable slice of real estate in the county. I watched in disbelief as land values around me soared. Parcels smaller than mine sold for hundreds of thousands of dollars. By the end of the first year, estimates put my property's worth at nearly $10 million. $10 million for a cabin I had bought for 25 cents. Friends and family couldn't believe it when I told them, and some accused me of making it up. But the numbers didn't lie. What had once been abandoned land was now prime real estate, and I was the lucky owner. Of course, such fortune never comes without attention. At first, it was harmless. Realtors sent me letters asking if I was interested in selling. Developers left business cards on the cabin's doorstep. Strangers sometimes parked nearby, walking the edges of my land as though sizing it up. I waved it all off, enjoying the absurdity of my luck. But then, things began to shift. It started with a letter, not from a realtor or developer, but from something called the Pine Valley Homeowners Association. I found it odd, because as far as I knew, my cabin wasn't part of any neighborhood or subdivision. The letter welcomed me to the community and listed a set of rules and regulations I was supposedly bound to follow. lawn maintenance standards, noise restrictions, even approved paint colors. I laughed, thinking it was some kind of mistake. My cabin was miles away from the manicured lawns of suburbia, tucked in a forest where no one cared about the color of a fence. I ignored the letter and thought nothing more of it. 2 weeks later, another letter arrived. This one was more serious. It claimed that my property, despite its isolated location, had been annexed into the jurisdiction of the Pine Valley HOA years ago. It cited vague legal documents, none of which I had ever seen, and demanded payment of past due HOA fees. The total was staggering. Thousands of dollars in fines and assessments, supposedly accumulated over years of neglect. Confused, I called the number listed at the bottom. A stern voice on the other end insisted that I was indeed a member of the HOA and that failure to comply would result in legal action. They spoke as though my ownership was irrelevant, as though the land itself already belonged to them. I hung up, unsettled but still convinced it was nothing more than an intimidation tactic. Yet more letters came, each one harsher than the last. Each one claiming that my ownership was invalid, that the HOA had the right to seize control of the property, and that I was nothing more than a trespasser. At first, I tried to brush it off as bureaucratic nonsense. But then came the day I returned to the cabin and found a bright orange notice nailed to the front door. It declared the property in violation of HOA code and warned of impending repossession. Standing there, staring at the notice, the weight of it all finally sank in. I had gone from owning a worthless cabin to holding a multi-million-dollar property, only to find myself at the center of a battle I never asked for. And the people I was up against weren't neighbors down the street or a casual association. They were a powerful, organized HOA determined to take everything from me. The cabin that had once felt like a miracle was now the spark of a storm I could no longer ignore. At first, I convinced myself that the bright orange notice nailed to the cabin door was nothing more than a bluff, an empty scare tactic meant to pressure me into paying money I didn't owe. But as the weeks went on, it became clear that the Pine Valley Homeowners Association was not going to simply back off. If anything, they seemed emboldened by my silence. Letters began arriving daily, each one more aggressive than the last. What started as demands for unpaid dues quickly escalated into threats of foreclosure, property liens, and even forced eviction. The language in their correspondence grew colder, more official, as though each envelope carried the weight of law behind it. They addressed me not as the legal property owner, but as an occupant, a word that cut deep, stripping me of the very rights I had secured with that ridiculous 25-cent purchase. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had gone from laughing at the absurdity of buying a cabin for less than $1 to facing the terrifying possibility of losing it, all because of an HOA I never agreed to join. I tried to ignore them, hoping that by refusing to acknowledge their claims, they would eventually give up. But the HOA wasn't content with sending letters. One afternoon, I drove up the gravel road and found 2 men in polos and clipboards walking the perimeter of my land. They carried cameras, snapping pictures of the cabin, the yard, even my car parked in the clearing. When I asked what they were doing, they simply told me they were conducting an inspection. Without another word, they climbed into their SUV and drove off, leaving me with the uneasy feeling that I was under surveillance. The harassment only escalated from there. Notices appeared not just on the cabin door, but also staked into the ground along the driveway. Some accused me of violating landscaping rules. Others claimed my cabin did not meet architectural standards. The absurdity of it all was almost laughable. How could a 100-year-old cabin in the middle of the woods possibly fall under the same set of rules as a cookie-cutter suburban house? But the HOA didn't care about logic. They cared about control. And now that my property was worth millions, I was a target. When I began to research Pine Valley HOA, I discovered something unsettling. They weren't like the average homeowners association. Their reach extended far beyond a single neighborhood. Over the years, they had slowly annexed parcels of land surrounding the town, pulling in properties that had no business being part of their jurisdiction. Farmers, small landowners, even families who had lived in the valley for generations, all had been strong-armed into compliance. Some fought back, but many more gave in, unable to afford the legal battles that followed. The more I read, the more it became clear. Pine Valley HOA wasn't just an association. They were a machine, a powerful organization with deep pockets, ruthless lawyers, and a reputation for crushing anyone who stood in their way. And now, they had set their sights on me. I knew I needed help, so I went to the county office to confirm the validity of my deed. The clerk pulled up the records without hesitation. Everything was in order. My ownership was legitimate, the taxes were current, and there was no mention of Pine Valley HOA anywhere in the county's files. Legally, they had no claim on my land. On paper, I was untouchable, but paperwork doesn't stop harassment. It doesn't stop intimidation. And it certainly doesn't stop organizations with the resources to bend the rules in their favor. It wasn't long before I discovered just how far the HOA was willing to go. The first real blow came in the form of a lien notice. According to the HOA, I owed them tens of thousands of dollars in unpaid fees, penalties, and special assessments. They filed the lien with such confidence that, at first glance, it appeared legitimate. My bank received a copy, and soon after, I got a call warning me that my property might be flagged as collateral against this so-called debt. It was a strategic move, not designed to win outright, but to drain me of time, money, and peace of mind. Still, I refused to budge. I spent hours combing through property law, talking to anyone who would listen, and documenting every letter, notice, and so-called inspection. If the HOA wanted a fight, I would be ready. But deep down, I knew that my 25-cent miracle had turned into something much darker. This wasn't just about my cabin anymore. This was about power, greed, and the lengths people would go to claim what wasn't theirs. And then came the night visit. I had been staying at the cabin more frequently, both to protect it and to escape the noise of the outside world. One evening, long after sunset, I heard the crunch of tires on gravel. Peering through the window, I saw headlights cutting through the trees. A black SUV stopped at the edge of the clearing. Two figures stepped out, flashlights in hand, sweeping the beams across the cabin. I froze in place, heart pounding, as they walked slowly toward the front porch. They didn't knock. They didn't speak. They simply stood there, scanning the property, as though silently reminding me that I was being watched. After a few minutes, they turned back, climbed into the SUV, and drove away. The silence that followed was deafening, but the message was clear. The HOA wanted me to know they were not going to stop until I gave up. By then, paranoia had set in. I began to wonder if my phone calls were being monitored, if my mail was being intercepted, if every step I took was being observed. Friends told me to sell while I could, to take the money and run, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. The cabin had become more than property. It was a symbol, proof that someone like me could stumble into fortune without playing by their rules. And that, more than anything, was why they wanted it gone. The breaking point came a month later, when I arrived at the cabin and found heavy machinery parked at the edge of my property. Bulldozers, trucks, and surveyor equipment stood in a neat row, accompanied by a sign that read, "Future site of Pine Valley Community Recreation Center." My jaw dropped as I realized what they were doing. The HOA wasn't just threatening me anymore. They were acting as if they already owned the land. The audacity was staggering. They had erected a banner claiming my property as their own, and they were preparing to break ground. For a moment, I stood frozen, staring at the machines, wondering how far they would really go. Then I noticed the workers milling around, casually staking markers into the soil. My soil. That was the moment I realized this battle wasn't going to be fought with letters and phone calls anymore. The HOA had escalated into physical action, and if I didn't push back now, I would lose everything. What I didn't know then was just how ugly things were about to get. The morning after I discovered the heavy machinery parked on my land, I drove straight into town, still reeling from the shock. The audacity of it all gnawed at me. The Pine Valley HOA hadn't just claimed my property on paper. They had, physically, moved equipment onto it, staking the soil as if my deed meant nothing. I knew then that this was no longer a simple harassment campaign. This was a calculated attempt to seize everything I had. I went first to the county recorder's office. The clerk, the same one who had confirmed my ownership weeks earlier, looked baffled when I explained the situation. She pulled up the files again and assured me that nothing had changed. My name was still listed as the sole owner. There were no liens recognized by the county, no annexation documents, nothing that gave the HOA any authority over my land. Legally, they were operating on smoke and mirrors, but the clerk also warned me of something chilling. Organizations. Like Pine Valley often thrived not by being right, but by being relentless. They buried their opponents in paperwork, drained them with legal fees, and wore them down until they had no fight left. That warning echoed in my head as I left the office. It wasn't enough to simply know I was right. I needed proof, undeniable evidence that would expose the HOA's tactics and shut them down before they steamrolled me. So I started digging. At first, it was just late nights spent researching. Pine Valley HOA online. I scrolled through community forums, local news articles, and even archived newsletters. Buried in years of digital clutter, I found threads of anger from homeowners who had once lived under their rule, families who had been fined into bankruptcy over trivial violations, elderly residents forced to sell their homes after the HOA imposed special assessments they couldn't afford. Developers who had mysteriously partnered with Pine Valley only to walk away with massive profits while residents footed the bill. The deeper I went, the darker it became. It wasn't just about enforcing neighborhood standards. Pine Valley HOA operated like a corporation masquerading as a community organization. They annexed land far outside their original jurisdiction, imposed rules retroactively, and extracted wealth from anyone unlucky enough to fall within their reach. And behind it all, the same names appeared again and again. A board of directors that had remained virtually unchanged for over a decade, each member wealthier than the last. I compiled everything I found into a growing folder of evidence, articles, scanned documents, screenshots of testimonies from residents, anything that painted a picture of corruption. But I knew I needed more. Paper trails were one thing, but if I wanted to fight back, I had to show that their reach extended directly into my property. That opportunity came sooner than I expected. One weekend, I returned to the cabin to find that the construction equipment was still there, but this time, workers had begun clearing brush. They were careful not to touch the cabin itself, but the sight of strangers cutting into my land filled me with rage. I kept my distance, hiding behind the tree line, and pulled out my phone. For hours, I recorded them hammering stakes into the ground, unloading supplies, and referencing blueprints labeled Pine Valley Recreation Center. I knew then that I had enough to prove they weren't just making idle threats. They were actively trespassing, building on land they didn't own. That night, as I reviewed the footage, a realization hit me. The HOA had overplayed their hand. In their arrogance, they had turned intimidation into a crime. But even with evidence in hand, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was one step behind them. Every day, their presence on my land grew stronger. Notices appeared faster than I could take them down. Trucks came and went, as if they had free rein, and worst of all, neighbors in town began treating me differently. Whispers followed me at the grocery store. Some locals who once offered me friendly smiles now looked at me with suspicion, as though the HOA's narrative had already poisoned their view of me. It dawned on me that Pine Valley's power didn't just come from lawyers and money. It came from influence, the way they controlled the story. To the community, I wasn't the rightful owner of a cabin. I was an outsider standing in the way of progress, a stubborn holdout refusing to cooperate with the grand vision of a recreation center that would supposedly benefit everyone. And in small towns, perception mattered almost as much as truth. The pressure mounted until it invaded even the quiet of the cabin itself. One night, I woke to the sound of voices outside. Heart racing, I crept to the window and peered into the clearing. Flashlights bobbed in the darkness, and I realized a group of men were walking the perimeter again. This time they carried tools, measuring tapes, stakes, clipboards. They weren't vandals or teenagers playing pranks. They were professionals, moving with precision, mapping out my land in the dead of night. I wanted to confront them, but fear held me back. Instead, I recorded again, capturing every moment as evidence. But as I sat there, clutching my phone, one thought kept repeating in my mind. They wouldn't be doing this unless they believed they could get away with it. The next day, I decided to expand my search. I visited the county courthouse, poring over records not just for my property, but for every parcel Pine Valley had annexed in the last 10 years. The pattern was unmistakable. Each time the HOA expanded, property values skyrocketed, and within months, development projects appeared. It was a cycle of exploitation, engineered to funnel wealth into the pockets of the board members. And then, I found it. The smoking gun. A document buried in the public archives marked as an annexation agreement. At first glance, it looked official, with stamps and signatures. But as I compared it to legitimate county filings, discrepancies leapt out. The formatting was off. The signature of one official didn't match other documents. The date of approval predated the actual meeting it supposedly referenced. In short, it was a forgery. I stared at the page, heart pounding. This was it. Proof. That Pine Valley HOA wasn't just corrupt, they were fraudulent. They had fabricated documents to claim land that wasn't theirs, and my property was just the latest target. But as powerful as this discovery was, it also made me a bigger threat. If they learned that I had uncovered their secret, I knew they wouldn't stop at intimidation. They would escalate further, doing whatever it took to silence me. That night, I drove back to the cabin with the forged document tucked safely into my bag. The air felt heavier than usual, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. For the first time, I locked the cabin door, a flimsy barrier against an enemy that seemed to close in tighter every day. I sat at the table, surrounded by my growing mountain of evidence, and realized that the fight had reached a turning point. I was no longer just defending a cabin, I was exposing a conspiracy. And that made me dangerous in their eyes. As the wind howled outside and the cabin creaked under the weight of the night, one thought lingered above all others. The battle had only just begun, and Pine Valley HOA was preparing to strike harder than ever. The discovery of the forged annexation document gave me hope, but it also painted a target squarely on my back. I knew that the moment Pine Valley HOA realized I had evidence against them, they would retaliate with everything they had. And they didn't waste any time. The first strike came in the form of a lawsuit. Thick envelopes arrived at my mailbox, each one filled with legal jargon and stamped with the HOA's letterhead. They accused me of trespassing on their land, of interfering with a development project, of willfully refusing to pay thousands in mandatory fees. The stack of papers was overwhelming, designed to bury me under the weight of procedure and deadlines. I skimmed through the documents in disbelief. Each accusation was twisted, built on lies and half-truths. They claimed my deed was invalid, that the county had made a clerical error, and that the HOA had rightful ownership dating back years. It didn't matter that I had the original deed. notarized and stamped. In court, perception and persistence often outweighed common sense, and Pine Valley had the lawyers to drag this out indefinitely. Hiring my own attorney was expensive, but I had no choice. I met with a local lawyer who had dealt with the HOA before, and though he believed in my case, his face carried the weariness of someone who knew the battle would not be easy. He warned me that Pine Valley thrived on attrition. They'd stretch proceedings for months, even years, hoping to bleed me dry financially and emotionally, but I refused to give up. As the legal war raged, the harassment intensified on the ground. One evening, I returned to the cabin to find the front porch torn apart. Wooden boards were splintered, nails scattered across the dirt. It looked as though someone had deliberately ripped sections of the deck apart. There was no note, no signature, just destruction. A silent warning that they could reach me any time they wanted. Another night, I found tire tracks leading straight into my clearing, deeper than usual, as if a heavy truck had barreled in. When I checked the cabin, I discovered one of the windows shattered. Inside, papers were strewn across the floor, cabinets pulled open. Nothing appeared stolen, but the message was clear. They had been inside. The sanctity of the cabin once. My refuge had been violated. I reported everything to the sheriff's department, but the deputies shrugged it off. To them, it was a civil dispute, not a criminal case. One deputy even admitted in a hushed tone that the HOA had friends in high places. It wasn't the first time they'd heard of Pine Valley intimidating residents, and it likely wouldn't be the last. The implication was obvious. I was on my own. And so the war of attrition dragged on. Weeks turned into months, and every day brought new battles. Some mornings I'd wake to find fresh notices plastered on the cabin, each one threatening fines or demolition. Other days I'd drive into town only to hear whispers behind my back, neighbors repeating the HOA's narrative that I was a squatter standing in the way of community progress. The smear campaign was effective. The more they painted me as an outsider, the more isolated I became. But through it all, I clung to the evidence I had gathered. The forged annexation document remained my lifeline, proof that the HOA's entire claim was built on fraud. I knew it could turn the tide if I could get it in front of the right eyes. One day, that chance arrived unexpectedly. A local reporter, intrigued by the lawsuit, reached out to me for an interview. She had heard whispers about Pine Valley's tactics, but needed something concrete. Nervously, I agreed to meet her at the cabin. When she arrived, she was struck by the absurdity of the situation. The old wooden cabin, surrounded by untouched wilderness, looked nothing like the sterile suburban neighborhoods Pine Valley usually governed. I laid out the documents for her, explaining the forgery, the trespassing, the harassment. She listened, intently, jotting down notes, her eyes widening as the puzzle pieces fit together. "This isn't just a property dispute," she finally said. "This is corruption." Her words gave me a flicker of hope. If the public learned the truth, maybe the HOA's power would begin to crack. But I also knew that exposure would provoke them further, and I was right. Within a week of the article's publication, the HOA retaliated harder than ever. Suddenly, I was buried under new lawsuits. One accusing me of defamation, another alleging environmental violations for neglecting the land. They filed noise complaints, zoning complaints, even claims that I had endangered wildlife. Each accusation was baseless, but each one required time and money to fight. At the same time, the intimidation grew bolder. Vehicles idled at the edge of my clearing late at night, headlights trained on the cabin for hours. Strange phone calls came in at odd hours, silence on the other end before a click. Once, I discovered dead animals, squirrels and birds, deliberately placed on the cabin steps. It was psychological warfare, meant to break me down piece by piece. The stress was relentless. I stopped sleeping, always on edge, waiting for the next attack. My savings dwindled as legal fees piled up, and the dream of owning a multi-million-dollar property began to feel more like a curse than a blessing. Friends urged me to walk away, to sell what I could and escape, but I couldn't. Not anymore. The cabin had become a line in the sand. If I surrendered, Pine Valley HOA would win not just against me, but against everyone they had ever steamrolled. And so, I pushed forward. I strengthened my case, gathering more testimonies from former residents who had suffered under the HOA's rule. Some were reluctant to speak, too afraid of retaliation, but others saw in me a chance to expose the truth. Slowly, I built an army of voices, each one chipping away at Pine Valley's facade of authority. But just as I felt momentum building, the HOA unleashed their most devastating move yet. One crisp autumn morning, I arrived at the cabin to find it draped in yellow tape. A notice had been nailed to the door, stamped with official county seals. It declared the property condemned, citing structural instability and safety hazards. My stomach dropped as I read the words. According to the notice, I was barred from entering the cabin until further inspection. I knew instantly what had happened. Pine Valley had leaned on someone in the county, using their influence to turn my refuge into forbidden ground. And without access to the cabin, I was cut off from the very evidence and shelter that anchored my fight. Standing there in the cold morning air, staring at the yellow tape fluttering in the wind, I felt the weight of defeat pressing in. For the first time, doubt crept into my mind. Maybe they were right. Maybe no one could stand against them. But deep down, another voice whispered back. They had gone too far this time. Condemning my cabin wasn't just intimidation. It was an abuse of power that could not be ignored. If anything, it proved how desperate they were to break me. I turned away from the cabin, fists clenched, determination burning hotter than ever. The battle was far from over. The HOA might have stripped me of my home for now, but they hadn't silenced me. If anything, they had just handed me the proof I needed to bring their empire crashing down, and I was ready to strike back. The day the county condemned my cabin should have been the end of the fight. Standing there with yellow tape stretched across the porch, a government seal stamped on the notice, and the property I had once proudly called my own labeled uninhabitable, it would have been easy to give in. That's what Pine Valley HOA expected. They wanted me broken, humiliated, and out of the way. But instead, something inside me hardened. If they were willing to go this far, it meant they were afraid, and fear meant weakness. I drove back into town that same day, not to wallow in defeat, but to escalate my counterattack. My first stop was the county office. I demanded to see the inspection report that had led to the condemnation. After an awkward delay, the clerk handed me a thin file, far too thin for something so severe. Flipping through the pages, my suspicions were confirmed. The so-called inspection had been nothing more than a single-page statement signed by one inspector, claiming the structure was unsafe. There were no photographs, no measurements, no supporting evidence. It didn't take much digging to connect the dots. That inspector had ties to Pine Valley HOA, a brother-in-law on the board, financial dealings that weren't exactly hidden. The condemnation wasn't about safety, it was about control. Fueled by rage and determination, I contacted the reporter who had interviewed me before. When I showed her the inspection file, her eyes widened in disbelief. "This isn't just corruption," she said. "This is collusion." She promised to dig deeper, and within days, a second article appeared in the local paper. This time, it didn't just tell my story. It exposed the HOA's manipulation of county officials, naming names and citing connections. The article hit harder than I expected. Suddenly, the whispers in town began to shift. People who once looked at me with suspicion now approached me quietly in the grocery store, slipping notes into my hand with their own stories of Pine Valley's abuse. Elderly residents told me about being fined for faded shutters. Small business owners shared how they were squeezed out of land deals. Farmers revealed how they had been annexed against their will. My case had struck a nerve, and for the first time, I wasn't standing alone. With this momentum, I decided to escalate legally. My lawyer filed a countersuit against the HOA, not just to defend my ownership, but to accuse them of fraud, trespassing, and conspiracy. We submitted the forged annexation document, the footage of workers trespassing on my land, and testimonies from other victims. Piece by piece, we began to construct a wall of evidence too strong for the HOA to dismiss, but Pine Valley wasn't about to roll over. They doubled down, flooding the court with motions, burying us in paperwork designed to stall progress. They held meetings where board members painted me as a dangerous agitator, someone threatening the future prosperity of the community. Flyers appeared in mailboxes around town, twisting my story into a tale of greed, portraying me as a stubborn landowner, blocking the construction of a recreation center that would supposedly benefit children and families. It was a smear campaign, and for a while it worked. Some locals turned cold again, convinced by the HOA's propaganda. But the louder they shouted, the more cracks began to show. People started questioning why the HOA was so desperate to discredit one man over a cabin in the woods. And those who had quietly suffered under Pine Valley's rule finally began to speak up publicly. Then came the town hall meeting. The county scheduled it to address growing concerns over Pine Valley HOA's reach, and the room was packed. Board members sat smugly at the front, flanked by lawyers, while residents filled every seat, lining the walls. When my turn to speak came, I stood before them with trembling hands but steady resolve. I laid out everything: the fraudulent annexation, the harassment, the bogus condemnation. I held up the inspection report for everyone to see, its thinness a glaring symbol of corruption. For a moment, the room was silent. Then, murmurs began to spread. People looked at the board members with suspicion, and I saw their smug expressions falter. For the first time, they weren't in complete control of the narrative. That night marked a shift. Local media picked up the story, framing it not as a personal feud, but as a broader battle against HOA abuse. Calls came in from neighboring towns, residents who had experienced similar situations. My fight was becoming a symbol, proof that Pine Valley wasn't untouchable, but with publicity came danger. The harassment escalated into outright sabotage. One morning, I discovered my truck's tires slashed. Another night, I heard gunshots echo through the woods, distant but close enough to send a chill down my spine. The message was clear. I had poked the hornet's nest, and now they were out for blood. Despite the fear, I refused to back down. Instead, I leaned into the growing support. A small group of residents formed around me, calling themselves the Valley Collective. They were tired of Pine Valley's stranglehold and wanted change. Together, we pooled resources, shared information, and built a case strong enough to attract attention beyond our county. A regional news station picked up the story, broadcasting the corruption to a wider audience. With the spotlight glaring, cracks in the HOA's foundation widened. Whistleblowers emerged, a former secretary who admitted she had been pressured to forge signatures, a contractor who revealed he had been paid under the table to falsify invoices. Each revelation chipped away at Pine Valley's carefully constructed image. And then, just when it seemed momentum was fully on my side, the HOA played their most desperate card yet. A letter arrived, not in the mail, but slipped under my lawyer's office door. It was unsigned, typed on plain paper, but the message was chilling. Drop the case or you'll regret it. Attached was a photograph of the cabin, taken at night, the silhouette of a figure barely visible in the foreground. It was a warning, unmistakable and personal. When I saw it, my blood ran cold. This wasn't about legal intimidation anymore. This was a direct threat to my safety. But instead of backing down, I felt something shift inside me. Fear gave way to resolve. If they were resorting to threats, it meant we were close to breaking them. They wanted me to quit because they knew they were losing. The Valley Collective rallied around me, and together, we decided to push harder than ever. We organized petitions, demanded independent audits, and flooded the county with calls for investigations. The louder we shouted, the harder it became for officials to ignore us. Still, the cabin remained condemned, the yellow tape a constant reminder that I was not yet free. I visited often, standing outside the barrier, reminding myself what was at stake. It wasn't just about land anymore. It was about proving that ordinary people could fight back against corruption, no matter how powerful the enemy. As winter settled over the valley, the battle lines were clear. Pine Valley HOA was wounded but dangerous, lashing out with threats and sabotage. I was battered but determined, bolstered by a growing movement. The fight was no longer just mine. It had become a war for the soul of the valley, and the final showdown was drawing near. Winter in the valley was unforgiving that year. Snow blanketed the pines, and the gravel road leading to my cabin disappeared under a thick crust of ice. Yet even as the world outside fell silent, the war with Pine Valley HOA raged louder than ever. Every day brought fresh threats, new lawsuits, and whispers of retaliation. But just as they were tightening their grip, cracks began to spread through their foundation. The exposure in the media had done more damage than they anticipated. Local news had snowballed into regional coverage, and soon national outlets picked up the story. A man who bought a cabin for 25 cents, now locked in a multi-million-dollar battle against a ruthless HOA. It was a headline that captured imaginations, and suddenly the spotlight was no longer on me, but on Pine Valley. Their tactics, once carried out in the shadows, were now dissected on television, in newspapers, and across the internet. For the first time, the HOA couldn't control the narrative. The board members who once strutted through town with arrogance now ducked away from cameras. Reporters camped outside their offices, demanding answers they could no longer spin, and while they tried to drown me in legal filings, their strategy backfired. Every new lawsuit only reinforced the perception that they were bullies trying to crush an ordinary man. Behind the scenes, the Valley Collective worked tirelessly. We organized rallies at the courthouse, filling the steps with signs that read, "Stop HOA tyranny and our land, our rights." Residents who had once lived in fear began to speak openly, emboldened by the growing movement. Former board employees came forward with damning testimony, describing backroom deals, falsified documents, and intimidation tactics. The walls were closing in on Pine Valley. Then came the breakthrough. The reporter I had been working with uncovered a trove of internal emails from a whistleblower within the HOA. The messages revealed a deliberate strategy to annex land illegally, forge inspection reports, and funnel profits into private accounts controlled by board members. The emails even referenced my cabin specifically, describing it as a prime acquisition target worth millions once the owner could be neutralized. Reading those words sent a chill through me, but it also filled me with vindication. Their entire scheme was now laid bare, black and white proof of everything I had claimed. When the emails hit the press, the fallout was immediate. State investigators announced a formal inquiry into Pine Valley HOA. County officials scrambled to distance themselves, suddenly eager to cooperate after months of indifference. And most importantly, a judge reviewed the evidence and issued an injunction halting all HOA activity on my property. The yellow tape that had bound my cabin was ripped away, the condemnation notice officially voided. After months of being locked out, I stepped back into my cabin with tears stinging my eyes. The boards creaked under my boots. The air smelled of dust and pine, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt home again. But the battle wasn't over. Pine Valley still had money, lawyers, and influence. They fought tooth and nail in court, denying the authenticity of the emails, claiming victimhood, painting me as the mastermind of a smear campaign. Yet every move they made only dug the hole deeper. The forgery of the annexation document was confirmed by forensic experts. The inspector responsible for the bogus condemnation confessed under oath that he had been pressured by the HOA board, and witness after witness testified to the culture of fear the HOA had cultivated for years. The trial stretched for weeks, the courtroom packed with residents, reporters, and curious onlookers. I sat at the plaintiff's table, exhausted but resolute, watching as the empire that had tried to crush me unraveled piece by piece. There were moments when doubt crept in, when the lawyers' cross-examinations twisted words, when the legal jargon grew so thick I feared the truth would be lost. But each time the evidence spoke louder than their lies. The verdict came on a cold spring morning. The judge's voice was steady as he declared Pine Valley HOA guilty of fraud, conspiracy, and abuse of power. Their claims to my property were nullified, their liens invalidated, their authority stripped. Fines were levied, assets seized, and several board members were referred for criminal prosecution. The room erupted in murmurs, gasps, even cheers from the residents who had suffered under their reign. For me, it was surreal. After months of fear, harassment, and sleepless nights, justice had been delivered. The cabin was mine, indisputably, undeniably mine. In the weeks that followed, the fallout spread through the valley. The HOA collapsed, under the weight of lawsuits and investigations. Board members resigned in disgrace or fled town altogether. Their glossy brochures and hollow promises were replaced by headlines of scandal. For the first time in years, residents breathed freely, no longer bound by arbitrary fines and intimidation. As for me, life slowly returned to something resembling normal. I repaired the cabin, replacing broken windows, rebuilding the porch, sanding away the scars of vandalism. The clearing that had once been crowded with heavy machinery was quiet again, filled only with the rustle of leaves and the call of birds. Developers no longer circled like vultures, and while the land was still worth millions, I held firm. I wasn't selling. The cabin had cost me 25 cents, but it had nearly cost me everything else. To me, it was priceless. Yet even in victory, the experience left its mark. I no longer saw the cabin as just a quirky investment or a stroke of luck. It had become a symbol of resistance, of resilience, of what happens when ordinary people refuse to bow to corruption. And while Pine Valley HOA had fallen, I knew others like them existed elsewhere, ready to exploit, to intimidate, to take. My story had spread far beyond the valley, inspiring others to stand up against similar abuse. Letters poured in from across the country, people thanking me for fighting back, sharing their own battles with HOAs. Sometimes I sit on the rebuilt porch, watching the sun set over the valley, and I think back to the day I placed that absurd 25-cent bid. I never could have imagined the storm it would unleash, or the strength it would demand of me. But in the end, the cabin gave me more than land or wealth. It gave me a cause worth fighting for. The HOA tried to take everything from me. Instead, they lost everything themselves, and as the wind whispers through the pines and the creek murmurs in the distance, I know one thing with absolute certainty. This cabin, this land, this victory, it's mine. Forever.